Hello, everyone, and welcome to another bonus episode of the Stephen King podcast. This is bonus episode number 2. And the purpose of these bonus episodes is to introduce the listeners to other writers that they might not normally be aware of or have heard of outside of the stuff that we do with the Stephen King podcast. And for this installment, we have a special guest, Sarah Johnson, who is horror writer the right handle for you, Sarah?
It depends on the story, I guess. Comfortable with that, with being called a horror writer?
Or speculative fiction?
Yeah, that's a good broad umbrella. I like that.
Alrighty, so for you out there that don't know Sarah, she's a Calgary, Alberta-based writer in Canada, and she just has recently released an anthology entitled Suicide Stitch, and I love that title, by the way, and we'll get into that in a bit more later on. So Sarah, why don't you give us a little bit of background on who you are and how you got to be where you are right now in your writing?
So right now, I don't write for a living. I write when I can. I work my day job, as all of us writers tend to have day jobs and sort of a Frankenstein income that we live on. I work as a literary events manager at Owl's Nest Books, which is Calgary's oldest independent bookstore. Mm-hmm. So I work a lot with a lot of writers and interact with, one thing I love is bringing writers and readers together. It's my favorite thing in the world. So I'm very fortunate to be able to have a job that is in line with my interests and my values. Mm-hmm. As for how I got to where I am, I'm sort of one of those weird writers who has not been writing all her life. I hear over and over again, I've been writing stories since I could hold a pencil. And I was not. I was never a writer. I was never a journaler. I was a voracious reader. My parents, bless them, gave no supervision whatsoever into anything that I read. So I read a lot of different things and things I was too young to understand. I just couldn't get enough. And so I think in that way, maybe I was writing, but just in myself, in my imagination.
Right.
And I didn't start writing seriously until about 7 years ago, actually.
Mm-hmm. So that would be about what, 2012, I guess?
About 2010.
10?
That was
okay.
Yeah, that was when I first started writing, and I took my first writing class ever.
Okay. And you mentioned that you were a voracious reader. Who were the writers that you'd like to read?
I loved Ellen Montgomery, like the Anne of Green Gables, Roald Dahl, Dr. Seuss, Anne Rice, Colleen McCullough. I read The Thornbirds when I was like 13 years old. Most of it went over my head. It would probably be a very different reading experience now. Right. Stephen King, of course, heavily, well, not just for me, influential for me, but just heavily influential to so many writers.
Right.
I cut my literary teeth on his work.
Right. And any favorite books of his?
I actually like his short stories more than his novels. I love his short stories. Him and David Morrell, I think, write just about, as I was growing up reading, probably the best, most memorable horror short stories.
Okay, so you've been voraciously reading for a large portion of your life, and then all of a sudden, you got the writing bug. Do you remember what sparked that?
I think I read Twilight.
Okay.
Based on the recommendation of a friend or cousin, I think. And I read it, and I thought, you know what? I can do better than this. And I proceeded to write a terrible novel. It wasn't vampires or anything, but it was this. I don't know why, but I wrote this like screwball romantic comedy, which isn't even a genre I typically read in. So I don't know why I thought this was a great idea. Mm-hmm. Yes. So that was the first novel I ever wrote, and it is in a drawer. I always look upon it affectionately, but it shall not see light.
Yes, I think everybody that's written has stories that they put away that they don't want anybody else to see.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So you did that, and then what happened?
And then I wrote another terrible novel.
Oh.
And my aunt, who is also a writer, I mean, she read all my early work and with a straight face told me to keep going, which I did. And then she handed me this brochure for a local writing organization called the Alexandra Writers here in Calgary.
Okay.
They were offering a year-long novel course.
Oh, nice.
You had to apply to get in. Mm-hmm. So I sent a writing sample. I wrote a little thing about why I would be a good fit for the class. So the idea was over the course of 12 months, you would complete a rough draft of a novel under an instructor's supervision and with critique and everything. And these were all totally new things. I'd never done them before. And I remember the first class, I go in there and I think I was 31 years old. And I hadn't been writing that long, and all the women were at least 10 years older than me. They'd been writing forever. They were so sophisticated. It just seemed to me that they knew everything about everything. I was so scared. I just thought, I am in way over my head.
Right.
And it was sink or swim. And it just happened to be a really great group. Like, these other writers really rallied around me and supported me and encouraged me.
Nice.
And without them, I probably wouldn't have kept going.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just starting to write myself, but I've only been doing it the last couple of years. So I think the biggest thing that starting writers don't realize is just how hard it is, because I think we all think it's easy, but then once you try to do it, then you realize how difficult it is.
Definitely.
There's a big dichotomy there. The things that the writing that looks really simple is really hard to do.
Exactly.
Right? Like, because we all tend to get in love with our own words and whatnot and that. So there's quite a learning curve there. And I can hear from your experiences that you've gone through that same type of experience as well. So It's interesting, though, that you started out with novels, and what I'm looking at here is your collection of short stories. So when did they come into play?
Well, what happens often, I think, when you start writing is a lot of people start with novels, and then they realize, oh, well, I guess I should start building a CV. I want to get some publishing credits under my belt. And so that's when they start writing short stories. For me, the first short story I ever wrote is actually in the collection, and only because it was solicited for an anthology that never actually came into being. It never got published. But the woman who was putting the anthology together and editing it, she is an amazing writer in her own right. Her name's Ria Tarvidas. She has a book called How to Pick Up a Maid in Statue Square. And that's a collection of short stories as well. She's fantastic. So I just have to promote her a little bit.
Right.
But I wrote a story and submitted a story to her that was twice the maximum word count and an utter unfocused mess. And she workshopped that story and worked with me over a period of a few months and in getting that story into shape. And I learned so much about writing and about short story writing from her. And that is really what made me fall in love with short stories. It made me fall in love with the challenge of them. It made me fall in love with how special they are.
Yeah, there's short stories are like they can be like a sharp jab, where a novel is much more like a long drink, I guess you could say. I really enjoyed reading your short story collection, and as I mentioned off the top, I really loved that title, The Suicide Stitch, and that story that you wrote. That's a pretty good story too. Is there any history behind that, or because it seems to pull in elements of things that I don't know if you have personal experience with, like such as the sewing and stuff like that, or?
Yeah. So Suicide Stitch is, at the time of publication, it was my most recently completed story. And I actually I'd been working on it anyway, but I wrote it for the collection to round it out. So it's about sisters, and one of the sisters has passed away suddenly, and the other is left to kind of close off her life. So she's going through the house, and her deceased sister was a hoarder and a seamstress. And that was one of probably the hardest story I've ever had to write, because I have a sister. We're very close. She's nothing like the one in the story. But anytime I tried to go into that headspace, try and imagine a life where I was here and my sister was gone, my brain just wouldn't go there. It just wouldn't.
Right.
And so sort of the beginning of that story sat on my computer for a couple of years before I could finally realize, like, that's what the main character's problem is. She can't accept it. Her just mind won't go there.
Right.
And with the sewing, my mom, all through my childhood, did a lot of sewing, and that's the sound of a sewing machine and the smell of sewing machine oil and just like scraps of cloth and the feel of everything. They're sort of really imprinted on my sensory memories. So it was really interesting going back to that time and thinking about all the sensory details of sewing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Cool. I have to say, like, I love the title, and I think that that title could be repurposed for so many different stories beyond the one that you've written.
Oh.
I don't know if you've thought about that at all, but I'm just throwing that out there because I Suicide Stitch, I'm thinking about like with medical procedures or,
Oh, yeah.
all these other kind of things. But I really enjoyed the story, and I'm just curious. You said that was the last one that you had written for this collection.
Right.
What time span do these short stories cover?
It's about 8 years worth of short stories. I don't really know what's normal because I'm too new to publishing to know, but I didn't write short stories with the idea that one day I would put out a collection. I just kind of wrote them and tried to sell them. And at a certain point, you find you have a lot of short stories. And there's 11 in Suicide Stitch, but I had submitted a packet of about, I think, 18 to my publisher. And of those, she looked at them and thought, okay, I think these ones go together.
Right. Because I'm thinking that, I don't know if it's an intentional theme on your part or not, but it's a lot of these stories about people feeling alienated or alone and trying to make connections. Is that something that you're aware of, or is that just me putting my perceptions on it?
I think it's both. It's been said that we tell the same story over and over again, just in different ways. And that's just something I'm really drawn to, people feeling out of place in their own lives and searching for some kind of meaningful connection.
Yes. And one of the nice things about your collections, too, is some of in general, when we have an anthology, whether it's from a single author or from a group of writers, there tends to be a overall theme of darkness in that. But I like your collection in that, like, some of the stories, like the first one, Thank You for Playing, has a very nice, optimistic, upbeat vibe to it. And I'm wondering where that Good Samaritan type of motif came from.
Well, that's an interesting story to talk about because it came about in a very unusual way. There is a literary festival that takes place in a different city in Canada every year called Reading Town. And the year it came to Calgary, they partnered with an organization called Find It that does like pop-up art installations in Inglewood and Ramsey, our oldest communities in the city.
Okay.
And so they thought, well, we live in, like, this is a really interesting neighborhood with a lot of history. Wouldn't it be cool to have a walking tour of this area and a story to go with it? So they asked me to write a story that could be broken into chunks. And at each stop on this walking tour through this old community, you'd get a piece of the story. So I thought, okay, I normally write like pretty dark stuff, so I'm going to attempt to write something that's a little bit lighter. And I think I succeeded, even though there is a bit of a sinister undercurrent to it. So I don't know, like a lot of people talk about like, oh, I can't write for themes and I can't like, like I just can't have these restrictions. But sometimes those restrictions can be inspiring. It takes your writing in a direction that you wouldn't normally take it. So that was a lot of fun writing that story.
Oh, cool. Yeah, well, it comes across. And I really enjoyed that story as well because it was so different than a lot of the other stories that are in your collection.
It's kind of like the bait and switch.
Yeah, yeah, because it's kind of like, okay,
God.
I'm expecting this to be a dark story, and it's kind of like an amazing story from that old Steven Spielberg TV show. I'm wondering too about in today's world, which is obviously there's a lot of stuff going on politically and so forth, socially. That's pretty unsettling, and I think a lot of writers or people are saying in general, like if we wrote about this, nobody would ever believe it would come true. So as a writer, do you find it in today's climate more difficult to be creative, or does it actually help your process, or are you not affected by it at all?
Well, that's an interesting question. Fiction, it bears the burden of plausibility, which truth does not.
Yeah.
Which is why I think I find reality much more upsetting than any fiction.
Yeah.
People think like, oh, horror writers, they must be just like creepy people who just get off on this kind of like violence and terror. But like really horror writers, I find are some of the most sensitive people.
Yeah, absolutely. I've found that out too.
And that's how they can reach into that like primal space within people where the fear lives. But I don't know if it consciously affects my creative process, but it must in some way, right? Like we're all products of our environment.
Yeah, like you don't have to fight the urge to get on a soapbox or anything like that.
Oh, I really try not to do that.
Yeah,
Like, of course, like anyone, I have strong opinions on certain things, but
yeah,
I try because I feel like that's reader abuse
yeah.
when you're telling a story, but really you're trying to trick the reader into reading your screed on whatever
Yeah.
issue it is. It's kind of like, the Marquis de Sade. He wrote all these like disgusting, salacious things, but really he was just trying to get people to read his like political, his polemic, essentially.
Right.
So I try not to do that. I try to really get into the character's point of view and just stick with what that person would feel and their opinions and how they would express them rather than trying to insert my own.
Okay, very good. Is there any other story in the collection that you would like to make special mention of? Because you have 11 of them in here. We've talked about 2. Is there any other story that you're particularly proud of, or on the other side of the coin, is there one that you wish you could have another crack at?
Like, honestly, the first one, Thank You for Playing, is probably my least favorite story. And I can't even tell you why. Like, it's not like I think it's particularly badly written or anything. It doesn't feel like me, I guess.
Yeah.
I learned some interesting things about writing it, but to me, I was just sort of surprised that my publisher would want to include it in the collection because it is so different.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually funny that you should ask, because you work on these stories so much that by the time the book comes out, you just never want to read them ever again.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just so sick of this. But probably my other story that I like is Little Sister, Little Brother.
Okay.
And it's the longest story in the collection. And it's actually being reprinted in Comet Press's Year's Best Hardcore Horror Volume 2.
Okay.
And that's out June 1st.
Nice.
It's kind of my first stab at a long short story. I find it really difficult to write short stories that are much longer than 5,000 words.
Right.
And this one, I think, is 13,000. So heading into novella territory.
Right.
But it was really interesting. So you have the space to wander like you do in a novel, but it's still not, but you're still telling sort of like one really crisp story as well.
Right. Okay. So you've got this collection out now, and what have you been doing since this has been released? What are you working on?
I've been working on, I have a novel coming out in September. It's called Infractus, and it's a grimdark dystopian fantasy, I guess you could call it.
Okay.
That's the novel I wrote in the year-long novel class that I took. I wrote the rough draft.
Okay. I'm sorry, what was the title again?
It's called Infractus.
And what does that stand for?
It means broken in Latin.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if it was a science fiction made-up word or something.
No.
Okay.
And it is. Some people have been calling it a science fiction novel, and I'm really hesitant to apply that label. I mean, it takes place in the future, and there are a few techie differences, but that's about the extent of the science fiction of it.
Right.
So that's coming out in September. So I've been working on the final edits of that.
Okay. And are you trying to position this as a series, or is it a standalone, or?
It is. So in that first year-long novel class, I wrote an obscenely long novel that was like 220,000 words.
Wow.
And I thought, yeah, I don't think anyone's going to publish this. And there was a very kind of natural breaking point in the middle for it to be broken into 2 books. So it's not a series. It's not a trilogy. It's just, what do you call it when it's 2? A duology or something?
I guess so, yeah.
Although that's funky as hell. Like, no one should call it that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just going to be 2 books. And the main character appears in Suicide Stitch, actually.
Oh.
The story 3 Minutes features this character as a child.
Okay.
And the novel is him all grown up.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Interesting. So which came first then, the short story or the novel?
The novel.
Ah.
The novel was started before I wrote my first short story.
Okay. So you've got the first book is coming out, and it's being published through
Driven Press.
Okay. And is that print, ebook, both?
Both. It'll be available in all the usual
places.
Yeah.
And yeah. All right. And are you thinking beyond that at this point, or are you just worried about getting the second half of the story and it's polished and into shape?
Yeah. Well, right now my main concern is getting the second half of the story polished up and ready. I've got a few other things. Like I think like most writers, we have multiple projects in various stages of draft work. I have another a horror novel.
Okay.
That's in about third draft. I've got a urban fantasy that's I don't even have a rough draft of it yet. I'm working on that. So I have a few other things.
Very good. And you said you just started writing recently. What is your work schedule like for you? Do you work every day, or do you have a block of time where you tell the family that don't bother me and all that kind of fun stuff?
Does that ever work? So since I did start writing 7 years ago, but I've been pretty intense in my study of craft. I've taken a lot of classes, a lot of workshops, done a lot of things in that time. I used to write almost every day. Mm-hmm. Now I don't, and I don't know if that's good or bad. I think I just kind of have to be okay with it. It's the point in my life I'm at now that I've got 3 kids who are busy, and I work part-time at the bookstore, so there's just not as much time for writing. But I mean, I'm still chipping away at it. But yeah, I don't know. I don't spend as many hours in a week writing as I used to.
Okay. Are you a morning writer when you were doing it?
I used to be a nighttime writer because when my kids were really little, of course, they need you and your constant attention during the day. So I wrote a lot at night. And now I don't know how I ever did that, because by 8 o'clock, my brain is just soup and I can't focus. But so, yeah, I write my most productive writing time is in the morning for sure.
Yeah, because I've talked to other writers too, and I think for a lot of us, we feel more creative in the morning, and it's at night where it's easier to do like the more analytical editing type of work. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
think it was Hemingway who said, "Write drunk and edit sober." For me, it's kind of the opposite.
Oh, okay. That's good. So maybe you could share your experiences of how you got your first bit of work published, and how difficult or easy was it for you to find someone interested in publishing your novel?
So are you talking about getting the short story collection published?
Yeah, you can talk about that first, and then
sure.
We'll follow up with your novel after.
Yeah, the short story, I call it my accidental short story collection. As
That's a good title for an anthology too.
How it happened was I had submitted the story I Am Lost,
right,
in the collection, to this publisher for a themed anthology. And she rejected it because it wasn't quite right for the theme, which is fine. It happens. But then I got another email from her just saying she hated to reject the story because she loved it. And did I have a lot of other stories in a similar vein? Could she look at them? Would I consider putting together a short story collection? And this was so out of the blue. And so, of course, I didn't reply to her for like 3 months.
Right.
But then I got to thinking about it, and I thought, okay, like, what can it hurt just to talk about this? Mm-hmm. The stories are already written. And so I started talking to her, and she had this really great, what sold me really was we shared this idea that changing the landscape of male-dominated genres involves like women working harder to put their work out there. Right?
Okay. Yep.
Not just men making space, but like when we have the work, we need to put it out there.
Right.
So I was really passionate about that, and she was really passionate about that. So that's how, and I sent her the 18 stories, and of those she had 11 that she thought went together, and we went from there.
Cool. And is this the same publisher that you're printing your novel with?
Nope. The short story collection was published by EMP Publishing, and they're just a small press out of Kansas.
Okay.
And Driven Press is out of Australia, actually.
Wow, you're global.
Well, I wish I had some great story of how that happened, but really it was just duotrope.
Oh, okay. Cool. So that's something that you might want to expand upon a bit, because for new writers, that's something that they might not be familiar with.
Yeah, if you don't, Duotrope is a database of writing markets where you can put in certain search parameters. Like if you have a short story in the horror genre that you're trying to sell to a market that will pay you at least something, you can plug in all those search parameters and it'll give you a list of markets that you can submit to. It's an invaluable tool. It is subscription based, but I think it's only $5 US a month, and you can go month to month. You don't have to buy a whole year at a time. So duotrope.com for anyone who is struggling finding places to submit their work. It is a great resource.
Very cool. And I must admit, I'm a little jealous because it sounds like you've had a relatively easy time of getting published. Or am I just are you skipping over a lot of time?
I'm doing like the silent laugh right now.
You make it sound so easy.
I hide my bleeders very well. Because I write, almost everything I write skates between genres. It doesn't fit really well into any one genre. Mm-hmm. Like, is it horror? Is it fantasy? Is it literary? Is it like whatever? So that translates into a lot of rejection, shockingly.
All right.
So no, it's not easy. People may think that, but they're just looking at that one story you had published, not the 20 rejections that came before it.
Right.
And I don't like to complain about rejection. Like, I give myself privately, a to be miserable about it. But
right.
I just don't think that it's it's the business, right? Like, yep. This is the business of no.
Yep.
So, and I also, I try to submit strategically. Like, I don't use the scattergun approach. I try to find publications that are looking for the kind of work I write. I read if I can find content that they have online, I'll read that and I'll see if my stuff might fit with it. So yeah, I don't know, but I mean, still loads of rejections.
Okay.
Loads.
Oh, good. I just wanted to get that out there because it sounded like a dream come true. Like you had a fairy tale publishing career.
No, not. And there are people who have that, and really, it's just
luck.
It's tenacity and it's luck, right?
Yeah.
You do have those people who write a novel, and just like Aaron Morgenstern, who wrote The Night Circus for NaNoWriMo, and now it's just like this international bestseller. You do have that, but by and large, the experience is that you get rejected a lot. And every now and again, someone buys your story. Right.
Did you ever look into self-publishing? Because I think that's the landscape of publishing is very confusing for writers right now, unless you're obviously an established writer, because there's such it is really easy to self-publish your work, but I think a lot of people jump the gun and publish too early. But
some might say too easy, but
yeah.
So my thoughts on self-publishing are that I think it's great that the kind of work that we have, in books and stories that we have available to us aren't entirely curated by a very small group of gatekeepers now. I think that's the really great part about it. I think part of the problem is, yes, that people get to be in too much of a hurry to publish. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of really great self-published books, but there's also a lot of garbage. I mean, you could say the same thing for traditionally published, but what breaks my heart is when I read a short story collection or a novel that's self-published, and I just think, if this person had just written a few more drafts, if they had it edited better, and it is a heartbreaking feeling, because you can see the potential in the work that has not been realized because that author either didn't have the patience or didn't realize that it takes years and years to hone your craft.
Right.
And you can see, what the story could have been.
Right. And I think that ties into, you mentioned that you had taken a lot of courses or workshopping. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think that writing advice wise, like, people say, well, first of all, you have to, I think Stephen King even said it, you have to read a lot, you have to write a lot.
Yeah.
And of course, I had the reading a lot thing down. You just can't get my nose out of a book hardly. Yeah. But so you read a lot, you write a lot, but you also need to engage in some active learning, like taking workshops, taking classes, finding mentors. And I think the value of that is really, it's really weird. Some people sneer at the idea of taking writing classes. Mm-hmm. Well, you can't teach creativity. It's like, well, no, but we're not just artists, we're craftsmen.
Yep.
And there is a technical aspect to writing that can be learned, and it can improve your writing. And plus, just when you take classes, you get exposed to all kinds of influences and other writers. And when they read your work and they give you feedback, it's invaluable experience. I don't know where I'd be if I hadn't taken classes and workshops and gotten critique.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, because I think the romantic notion of a writer is that they're, holed up somewhere in a cabin all by themselves, writing away. And to the degree of the actual craft of the writing or the doing of the writing, that is definitely true. But everything else around it really requires you to be connected to, other people in the world at large, because that's the fuel that feeds your creative engine.
Oh, yeah. Well, and you just hit on something really important, which is it is so important to be part of a writing community.
Yeah.
No one else in your life is going to get what you do.
Yes.
So you need those other writers in your life. It's really important to stay healthy and to stay grounded.
Yeah. So is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that you would like to bring up or talk about at this time?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you, Sarah. It was great talking to you. I wish you all the best with your career and your 2 novels coming up.
Yes, thank you.
And hopefully our listeners out there have enjoyed this. And so please check out Sarah Johnson's collection, Suicide Stitch, and her first novel coming out when again?
In September 2017.
And it's called Infractus, right?
Yes.
All right. Very good. Well, thanks a lot, Sarah. It was very nice talking to you.
Thanks for having me, Lou.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.